A man walks into a rural Quebec farmhouse in 1989 and finds 12 people living in the basement, some missing fingers, others bearing fresh scars from surgery performed without anesthesia. What I've learned covering atrocities across 3 continents is that the worst ones rarely announce themselves. They hide in plain sight. In May 1989, a Quebec provincial police officer approached a farmhouse near Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce. The locals had complained about screaming. What he found inside would become one of Canada's most documented cases of systematic abuse, and it had been happening for 12 years. The man at the center of it all was Roch Thériault, 43 years old, charismatic, a former convict who'd reinvented himself as a self-proclaimed healer and spiritual guide. In 1977, he'd gathered a small group of vulnerable people, the mentally ill, the broke, the desperate, and convinced them they were part of something sacred. He called it the Anthill Kids. The name wasn't chosen by accident. Thériault told his followers they were ants and he was the queen. Ants don't question the queen. Ants obey, they work, they sacrifice themselves for the collective. By 1989, there were 12 of them living in the basement and farmhouse, some born into it, others trapped by debt, manipulation, and a leader's carefully constructed mythology. I've read the court documents myself. The specifics are difficult to articulate on camera, but here's what matters. Thériault had convinced his followers that he possessed supernatural healing powers. When someone got sick, he didn't call a doctor. He operated, without training, without sterilization, without anesthesia. He removed teeth with pliers. He drained infections with kitchen knives. He performed cesareans on pregnant women using whatever was at hand. One follower, Solange Boilard, was pregnant. Thériault decided her baby was dead inside her. He performed an operation. The child died. He buried it in the basement. When another woman named Nicole Matevier developed an infected wound, he cauterized it with a blowtorch. She survived that, others didn't. But physical torture was only half of it. Thériault controlled every aspect of their lives. He assigned sexual partners. He decided who could eat and who couldn't. He renamed people. He created a system of punishment that included public humiliation, sleep deprivation, and forced labor. He convinced them that the outside world was dangerous, that he was their only protection, that leaving would mean death. What fascinates and horrifies me in equal measure is how he maintained this control. He wasn't the biggest. He wasn't the strongest. He was simply the most psychologically precise. He'd tell followers they had diseases only he could cure. Then he'd cure them with rituals that changed nothing except their dependence on him. It's a pattern I've seen replicated in cults across the globe, the weaponization of hope. By 1989, Thériault had become increasingly unstable. His surgeries were more frequent, his punishments more severe. One follower, Claude Ouellet, was beaten so badly that Thériault himself thought he'd killed him. He didn't. Claude survived, but when neighbors heard the screaming, they finally called police. That's what brought that officer to the farmhouse on that spring morning. What the officer found defied belief. 12 traumatized people, missing teeth, scars from unauthorized surgery, malnutrition, psychological deterioration. Some could barely speak. Others didn't understand they were being rescued. Thériault had convinced them so thoroughly that the police were enemies that several residents initially refused to leave. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what had happened. 12 years, thousands of acts of violence, a death that should never have occurred. Thériault was arrested and charged with multiple counts of assault, unlawful confinement, and criminal negligence causing death. But here's where it gets complicated, and this is where the psychology of cult dynamics becomes visible in the legal system. Several of his followers testified against him, but others defended him in court, even after rescue, even after seeing the evidence of their own abuse. That's the depth of psychological control we're discussing. Some victims had internalized his worldview so completely that they couldn't imagine life outside it. The cult hadn't just damaged their bodies, it had colonized their minds. Thériault was convicted in 1993. He received a 25-year sentence, but in 2011 he was granted day parole. In 2018 he died in prison from natural causes at age 72. He never expressed remorse. He never acknowledged the damage he'd caused. Even in his final years, he maintained his mythology that he was a healer, that his followers owed him everything. The survivors of the Anthill Kids have spent decades rebuilding their lives. Some have spoken publicly. Others have chosen silence. Their recovery is ongoing. What the case reveals is something crucial. Cults don't require exotic theology or remote locations. They require a leader willing to exploit human vulnerability, and followers desperate enough to believe that surrender means salvation. I've spent my career documenting human cruelty. What stays with me about the Anthill Kids isn't the violence, though it was severe. It's the precision of the control. Thériault understood something fundamental about the human need to belong, to believe, to surrender agency to someone who promises certainty. He weaponized that need, and 12 people paid the price. The Anthill Kids case remains a textbook example in cult studies. Researchers cite it when teaching about coercive control, psychological manipulation, and the limits of rescue. But numbers and academic language obscure what happened. 12 human beings were systematically tortured by someone they'd learned to trust. That's the real story. That's what matters. If you've watched this far, you understand something that casual true crime consumers often miss. Cults aren't about the leader's power. They're about the follower's vulnerability. Understanding that distinction changes how you see these cases, and it changes how you recognize warning signs in real time. Subscribe, we explore a new documented cult case every week, and each one reveals something darker about how control actually works.